Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to present his much-anticipated victory plan at the upcoming Ramstein meeting in Germany. Now, this plan outlines Ukraine's strategy to defeat Russian forces and secure a peace settlement on Kyiv's terms, involving a combination of military, political, and economic actions. While its full detail remain undisclosed, Ukraine's demand for more advanced weaponry and NATO membership are key points of discussion. How will Ukraine's ally respond, and can this plan bring a just end to the war? Joining us today on TVP World to explore this issue is Joshua Burgin from the Warsaw Security Forum. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good to be back in the studios. Thank you.
So this victory plan, what do you think are some of the core elements, and how feasible do you think it could be when it comes to actually carrying it out?
Well, the plan is at this point undisclosed, so it's sort of a bit of a divination, but I would see sort of three major vectors. One is absolute advocacy. Ukraine is attempting to advocate with its allies and others as to the nature of the ongoing conflict and how it could be resolved. Two, within that, I'm certain there would be seeking permissions and/or blessings for continued long-range strikes, things that may be currently off limits, bringing that to the table in order to sort of bring the war to a heel. I'm sure it's also signaling what its sort of no-goes might be in terms of a negotiated settlement. And then last but not least, it's also probably beginning to at least message some terms around what it looks like once things are over in terms of international investments and other things. So it sounds like there's a lot of things happening at once. I mean, Ukraine is not independent from its allies and partners in terms of weapons and supplies. To be clear, Russia isn't either.
Right.
Russia needs China, North Korea, Iran, and others as much as Ukraine needs its Western allies and partners. And unlike Ukraine, Russia's allies and partners are not drawing significant red lines, with the exception of Xi Jinping has clearly said, don't go nuclear.
Right. And, well, one thing that I immediately noticed within this peace plan, victory plan, let's call it, is the lack of reclaiming the Ukrainian territory that was lost during the war, which Zelensky has been very adamant about in his past iteration of what victory means for Zelensky. Do you think that he is kind of slowly toning down that rhetoric to kind of try to reach some concession, or do you think it's kind of just behind the tables?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think he has to lead with that. And if Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky being the obvious figurehead, is willing to negotiate on territory, my guess is they're not willing to surrender all four. But what that looks like, I don't know. As you touched on, there is uncertainty around the U.S. political environment. I sort of envision the status quo if the Democrats win. While it's unclear what Trump would do, it's not hard to envision him coming in with let's just say, undiplomatic approaches to let's settle this, let's get this done. And I suspect whatever a Trump administration might do would be probably not necessarily neither Russia nor Ukraine would probably be happy about it, but it might well move faster than the current status quo, which seems to be hamstrung by the notion that there is concerns around escalation, there's concerns around getting everybody to agree. It's hard to get consensus, from the number of partners that exist out there, whereas it's really fascinating to see what's going to come. But I think the whole effort here with the victory plan is just sort of set terms, signal, again, continue to sort of do what needs to be done in terms of messaging, but also negotiating with our partners, allies, as well as signaling what they want for the future.
All right, I think signaling is a key word here that you mentioned. And
this is clearly a political document.
Right. Do you think the timing also has something to do with that? Like you mentioned, there is a little bit of uncertainty when it comes to U.S. election, especially if Donald Trump does get into office. There's a lot of question marks there, and perhaps proposing this victory plan and setting the tone, the backdrop, the framework for this messaging would probably help lay out in a common consensus of what Zelensky wants achieved, and maybe give him a better position when it comes to negotiating with Donald Trump.
I don't think that it's exclusively about the looming presidential election. Mm-hmm. I think we haven't seen anything noteworthy. There's been a bit of a media lull. I mean, there's the day-to-day, right? But we haven't seen anything significant, and it makes sense to lead on that front. setting your strategic messaging, setting your asks and your sort of no-goes, establishing terms. Because if you don't do it, someone else will. That said, the looming presidential election in the United States and other sort of elections have taken place in Europe. It's time for this sort of approach from the standpoint of Ukraine. I think it's smart. Again, the fact that we can't see it is a little frustrating, but by the very nature of these things, it's kind of a necessary factor.
Right, and you also mentioned elections across Europe, and we do see, unfortunately, what people call Ukraine fatigue kicking in.
Certainly.
And when it comes to the polling numbers of all the parties that are more skeptical about Ukraine's victory have been gaining grounds. Do you think there's anything that Zelensky can do, or any part of this victory plan, once proposed and with more details coming up, could somewhat change the tides?
Well, I think this is a document that's by insiders for insiders and necessary for their communication. I've long been sort of critical, and I don't mean a harsh critic, but just offering sort of positive critique to Ukrainians who would listen, that it's very important to be working at the highest ministerial and presidential levels, but that there has not been as much, in my view, sort of grassroots or grass tops level thank you and advocacy in the way that I would like to see across the transatlantic alliance. That includes places like Kansas, as much as it does places like Szczecin in Poland. So the notion that there are people that are making policy decisions in capitals, but then there's actual laborers, workers, supply chain personnel that also need to sort of understand the why and the notion of gratitude being part of that explanation. This to me is something that hasn't been done for a while. And there's no question that fatigue does set in. We've consistently seen this in U.S. polling about 2 years, and support for any sort of foreign war tends to sort of wane. So it would be no different here.
Right, like you mentioned, perhaps there's a disconnect when it comes to messaging. The decision maker, policymakers level are pretty well aware of the situation in Ukraine, but I think a lot of electorate are seeing this as an economic drain. Is there any way that, well, maybe be it Ukraine or its ally, do a better job in messaging and trying to get the point across?
Well, I think this is both on Ukraine, but I think it's also on leaders of the Western Hemisphere and the Transatlantic Alliance. The reality is that we are right now, we're seeing this around the globe. There is a contest ongoing for which leadership model, which countries and their leaders are going to control sort of the world model for the next 70 to 100 years. You have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea on one side of that equation, and anybody that can get to join them. And then you have sort of the leadership model that's worked for the last 70 to 100 years, which has brought unprecedented prosperity to the globe. I don't think we've done a very good job advocating, again, to that grass tops, if not the actual grassroots across the alliance, about what's at play, what the contest is, why a small community government, whether it's in rural Poland or rural US, rural Canada, are being targeted by Russian hackers or Chinese IP thefts or et cetera, et cetera. This is all part of a larger game. I think Russia may have stepped a little out of line, the game plan of some of the others, but nevertheless, it is an ongoing issue, and Ukraine, Russia is part of that. Should Ukraine prevail, should the West succeed in preventing Russia's assaults, it will go a long way towards, I think, reducing conflict in places like Asia.
Right. And going back to the victory plan, Zelensky spoke about a bridge towards negotiations and kind of forcing Russia into the negotiation table. How realistic do you think that is? We've seen kind of this discussion being had in the first peace summit with the exclusion of Russia, and a lot of the talking points, at least on the surface level, kind of mirrors the victory plan that Zelensky has been proposing. And it all centers around gathering allies and bringing Russia to the negotiation table. How feasible do you think that it could be achieved?
Well, I noticed that terminology bridge as well. Anytime you have a great gulf between two parties that are in disagreement, there's always the first question of, do we want to negotiate? Two, what are the terms of the negotiation? And that requires both parties to be willing to sort of reach across the chasm to bridge the divide, whatever that is. As you've pointed out, the messaging is not leading with, we must have all territories returned. But I also wouldn't assume that to mean that they don't expect to get some of that back. What does that look like? I do think that not only is this important signaling within the alliance, but I also think there's probably some important signaling being done to Russia as well right now.
And this is going to be proposed in the Ramstein meeting, which, well, it has already been proposed in the United States during Zelensky's visit to U.S. And, well, judging by the reaction of Donald Trump, be it Harris, be it Biden, whichever Zelensky has proposed his plan to, there's a little bit of mixed reaction there. Where do you think, how do you think the Germans or the Europeans will be reacting to this victory plan? As we know, we don't know the content of it, but maybe we can insinuate what's in there, judging by the reaction of some of these politicians.
You know, these are, by their very nature, closed-door scenarios.
Yeah.
What's playing out in the media, the media has an incentive for spinning it one way or another. It likes to spin drama. If everything was fantastic behind closed doors, and let's just assume for the moment that it is, what interest does the media have in covering that? So it helps to have some drama. We know that there's a great deal of divergence between what the alliance members, what their attitudes are towards how to support Ukraine, what's in Ukraine's best interest, what is escalation, what's too far, etc. I'm sure there will be a robust debate and much sort of negotiation, horse trading, arm twisting, etc. at Ramstein. That's the nature of these things.
Right. And last but not least, do you think that there will be, this is a pivotal point going forward? Do you think that his proposal of a victory plan and the Ramstein meeting will change the course of how events unfold, or is it just another event, another blip on the radar in the grand scheme of things?
It's fascinating. I once heard a line that I thought was great. The straw that breaks the camel's back is rarely the heaviest one. So can we predict with any sort of certainty that this is a definitive turning point? No, of course not. But as we know in these things, you keep stepping forward one step at a time, and eventually, successes and failures, but ultimately more successes than failures lead to eventual success. I applaud them for their continued efforts. I applaud them for taking leadership in this way and demonstrating to their allies, partners, and others watching that they continue and press forward and have a goal to live on, not just to live, but to succeed and be a successful partners of the nations of the world.
Very much so, not just surviving, but also thriving. And whether or not this will be the grass that breaks the camel's back, well, we have to wait and see. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, Josh. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Always a pleasure to see you, Ben.
Cheers.
Take care.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.